Good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'd like to welcome everybody to a live webcast from LaRouchePAC.com. Tonight is February 8th, 2013, and you're joining us for our weekly Friday night broadcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Tonight we will be following our format as we have before, with Mr. LaRouche's opening statements followed by discussion from inside the studio here. Joining us is Jason Ross and Dennis Mason tonight, and they are both editors on LaRouchePAC.com. So I'd like to give you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, for this evening's occasion, there are three aspects of a three-part common question of the strategic situation which confronts the United States at this time. The first of these issues, of course, is Glass-Steagall. Not that Glass-Steagall is a new subject, but very few people understand what its implications are, and it's time that be cleared up. Secondly, we have to deal with the fact that we have a war issue. The world is now on the edge of a general spread of thermonuclear warfare, and that's exactly what it is. There's nothing less than thermonuclear warfare of any significance as warfare right now. We already have enough warfare in local warfares, but this is a more general worldwide. Then thirdly, we have the question of two things which are the same thing. One is the SDI. The SDI policy still exists. It's a way of trying to, if you needed, to shoot down things that need to be shot down. It is also, in terms of defense of Earth. But the other side of the defense of Earth is looking at systems which we call the SDE, as opposed to the SDI. And these are pretty much the same thing in root design as the SDI, except the SDA deals with the defense of mankind and of the solar system, or parts of the solar system from now. So these three things combine what should be the strategy or the strategic policies of the United States now. They pertain implicitly to the questions of economy, but let's start with that. Now, people know about Glass-Steagall, or at least they should, if they have been awake in the past several years or longer. Glass-Steagall means that we cancel the ties of the United States. The affairs of the United States will no longer be subject to the private banking interests which have been behind the great hyperinflation drive now. It simply cancels it off. But the problem is this: once we agree we're going to go with the Glass-Steagall, we can immediately begin to end the hyperinflation which is threatening to destroy the United States in particular, but also Europe and other parts of the world now. So this is an integral part of this Glass-Steagall program. It means that we now have to find a way, and I know what the way is to develop Glass-Steagall, because what would happen is this with Glass-Steagall. Right now, the United States is dominated by a hyperinflationary swindle. And this has been going on ever since the cancellation of the Glass-Steagall program in the first place. Now, we now have a situation where most of the money outside, listed in banks and so forth, is worthless. It is already worthless. It's worthless by virtue of hyperinflation, which has now come to a certain limit. We have to shut it down. Now, most of those banks, which we have to shut off from Glass-Steagall program, will go bankrupt. They will evaporate. Most of their funds will disappear. Their incomes will disappear. But that's inevitable. It's either save the people or save swindlers. And I think the time has come. The swindlers had more than had their time. Now's the time for the people. Now, the problem here is this. If we take the total banking system, including the legitimate banking system as compared with the illegitimate banking system, what has happened is the legitimate banking system has been cut off from the income which it should have enjoyed or which it should have participated. So therefore, if we want to start a recovery of the United States economy, we have to take an additional measure. We have to introduce a new system, a credit system, which will be a function of the United States government And the credit system will be used primarily to conduit funds through their system, through the Glass-Steagall system and the banking system, for worthy investments supported by the U.S. government. So therefore you will have a banking system, a regular banking system, but this time supported by something was done immediately in the first session of the government of the United States. And at that point, the idea of a system was to give credit to the state, to the nation, in order to allow for and promote the increase of productive activities, agriculture, industry, and so forth, basic infrastructure, and so forth. Now, the only chance we have is that to get a real recovery. We could stop the bleeding now. We could stop the destruction now, simply by implementing Glass-Steagall alone. But the amount of secure funds and worthwhile funds available to continue the banking credit system to industry and government would be insufficient to recover, to actually build up the economy. So therefore we need a supplementary program based on the same policy as the first administration of the United States. And that would mean that we would actually be providing federal funding, not federal money, but federal funding. That is, the federal government would be taking the responsibility for creating this fund. Now, the fund would not be paid out entirely as one loan, like an ordinary loan of that type, to the persons who receive become the debtor. But simply they will get a progressive allowance of credit underwritten by the U.S. government if the government finds that worthy of the confidence of the people and the nation. So that's the way we have to function. We were going to have to also have a driver for a high-tech program. We can no longer continue to go backwards in terms of technology, which we've been doing now. If we go backward in technology, we will die en masse. And that will happen very soon because of the present condition. Look, we have most of the labor force of the United States is not productive. Most people are occupied in employment in positions which are not at all productive. They are simply switching money around. It's like you have all the clerks you want in the front office, but there's no factory in behind. This is the kind of situation which we would contend to face. So therefore, a credit system of the type conceived by Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, the program of Hamilton's which saved the United States from the crushing effects of its foreign debt obligations at that time. And therefore that becomes that's our issue. Now, at the same time, we have the question of the SDI-SDE, which I'll get into then. But then we go to another issue, the war issue. Presently, we are approaching, on a global scale, a general thermonuclear war. A general thermonuclear war. And the question is, you have great powers. China is a great power, a great thermonuclear power. Russia is a great power, a thermonuclear power. So therefore you have the British Empire, whose intention is to reduce the human population from currently 7 billion people to 1 billion people at a very rapid rate, is the chief instigator behind this war. Now you will observe that our Joint Chiefs of Staff have been fighting against the present administration now, to prevent such a war from being supported by the United States. Because if such a war were launched, you would have the threat of a general extinction of the U.S. and world population. Because what you're on the scale that to win a war, say a war on the one side between the British-controlled United States and on the other side China, India, and other countries. That war, the deployment of thermonuclear weapons for that war, which is what we're looking at, would mean a virtual extinction of much of the human population on this planet. Therefore, sane people do not want what the United States, under British direction, is doing now. And these are not British banks. The British banks are often sane, but the monarchy is not, at least in my terms. So therefore, that's the problem. Now, we have to understand this thing I raised first, the Glass-Steagall concept. Glass-Steagall is what is needed. Glass-Steagall, simply as a piece of legislation, is what is needed. But it cannot do the job by itself. It must take the opportunity created by Glass-Steagall and add to it another element of the federal government. And that element is the banking system, the credit system by which we will loan or take on responsibility for work which will be useful in terms of causing a growth in the population and increase in the productive powers of labor. Now, the biggest component of this will be one component, which is essentially necessary, absolutely indispensable, to save our agricultural production and to save many other related things. And without that project, which is the NWAPA project, which was designed in the middle of the 1960s, that project will be the lifesaver of the United States, of Canada in part, but also Mexico, northern Mexico. So therefore, that's a part of the program. It's a part of the combat to save the United States and other parts of the world. And without that program, first and foremost, you're not going to make it in this country. First and foremost, you must get Glass-Steagall through, first of all, among all economic-related policies. Glass-Steagall must be done immediately. It must be done first before any other financial legislation was installed. It must be done now, immediately. Because once that's done, then that act, combined with this provision I've indicated, for a credit system by the United States government itself, and that will save the United States. Now remains the question of war, but more than just war. You have, for example, we had in the World War II period, or in that generation, we had what was called the SDI. I became, in the course of things, one of the leading founders of the SDI program as a political program from the last half of the 1970s. And that grew internationally. I went into Europe for various other reasons as well. And from in Europe, among leading relevant German circles, French circles, the Gaullists in particular, Italian circles, other circles in other parts of the world, including India and so forth, we had an agreement among leading forces in these and related nations to establish a system of defense called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that was then, in due course, under the administration of a new president, was supported and continued to be supported throughout his entire 2 terms as president, Reagan. And that proposal would have saved the world from every step of problems that the world has suffered ever since. Because that institution of a Strategic Defense Initiative would have created a world system implicitly which would have ensured the ability of the nations to get out of this war complex and to find what we might call the equivalent of peaceful and productive solutions to the crisis of all humanity. For example, we have whole parts of the world that are suffering from a lack of economic development, physical economic development. And these areas should be, for example, they should break up the Euro system. It's breaking itself up anyway. We do not need a Euro system. We must return the nations of Europe to their original sovereignties. Maybe whatever they want to do with those sovereignties is their business. But they must be supported in going back to that kind of a system of sovereign nation states. beginning in Europe and going further. You can do nothing for Europe today. Nothing, unless you get the equivalent of Glass-Steagall for Europe, all of Europe nations. And you must then break up the Euro system, which was a fraud from the beginning. So these are measures which all come together. They're all the same issue, really. It's like the component parts of a system of government. All the parts must function, but all the parts must function according to their distinctive characteristics. And that's what the policy must be today. So we must get off this babbling that goes on in government today. We must realize we have to make a fundamental shift, a fast kick to the present situation. You cannot do it piecemeal. You've got to take a combination of measures with agreements largely on a world scale, because every nation in the world that's intelligent knows we cannot continue to go along with what we're doing now. We must stop it immediately, and we must take the appropriate totality of measures in the proper order of precedence. For example, before any financial reforms are made by the United States government, there must be Glass-Steagall first. Because the question is, if Glass-Steagall is on the agenda and you're serious about it, you cannot allow any financial legislation coming in from the federal government. Because on the one hand, under the old system, pre-Glass-Steagall, you would have one policy. You would go with hyperinflation and blow the whole thing out immediately. If you go with Glass-Steagall first, with its three essential components, the Glass-Steagall as such, a credit system, and then great projects such as NWAPA. Those three measures combined will assure a revival of the U.S. economy and reversal from this hell. But those measures, the threefold measures, must be supplemented by other measures, other reforms, including you have to have a reform of the international market. The Euro system cannot survive the present situation. The entire Euro system is probably without England only. But the present Euro system is going now into an immediate hyperinflationary explosion, which would probably wipe out most of the nations of Western and Central Europe. So therefore, this must come first. But at the same time, the other requirements, we must change the military policy. We must not have wars. You may have many wars, which are already bad enough, but any general major war will go to thermonuclear warfare. And it will include great major powers, Russia and China, which are major thermonuclear powers. And the United States called in to back up the British in starting World War Thermonuclear III. So these are the considerations which must be treated as not piece by piece, not separate measures. They must be one measure, one action initiated by the United States, encompassing all of these measures of action in one package. And if we do that, we can save the United States and probably can save the planet. If we don't do that and are unwilling to do this simple kind of one-stroke solution, you have to remember that the usual idea of reforms, of piecemeal reforms, has now just gone out the window. The idea that you should walk in on economic questions and related economic questions with this, a bit of this, and a bit of that, and a bit of this, and a bit of the other. That kind of negotiating by the Congress must cease. We now need a coordinated reform in which all the essential parts, and I'm speaking only of the essential parts, all of the essential parts must be put into place in a specific order. Without that, this nation is finished. And I don't propose to have this nation of ours finished.